The Alton Railroad was the final name of a railroad linking Chicago to Alton, Illinois, St. Louis, Missouri, and Kansas City, Missouri. Its predecessor, the Chicago and Alton Railroad, was purchased by the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad in 1931 and was controlled until 1942 when the Alton was released to the courts. On May 31, 1947, the Alton Railroad was merged into the Gulf, Mobile and Ohio Railroad. Jacob Bunn had been one of the founding reorganizers of the Chicago and Alton Railroad Company during the 1860s. Main lines included Chicago to St. Louis and a branch to Kansas City. The former is now part of Union Pacific, with Metro Heritage Corridor commuter rail service north of Joliet. The latter is part of the Kansas City Southern Railway system. History. The earliest ancestor to the Alton Railroad was the Alton and Sangamon Railroad, chartered February 27, 1847 in Illinois to connect the Mississippi River town of Alton to the state capital at Springfield in Sangamon County. The line was finished in 1852, and as the Chicago and Mississippi Railroad extended to Bloomington, Indiana 1854 and Joliet in 1855. Initially trains ran over the completed Chicago and Rock Island Railroad to Chicago. The Joliet and Chicago Railroad was chartered February 15, 1855 and opened in 1856, continuing north and northeast from Joliet to downtown Chicago. It was leased by the Chicago and Mississippi, providing a continuous railroad from Alton to Chicago. In 1857 the C&M was reorganized as the St. Louis, Alton and Chicago Railroad, and another reorganization on October 10, 1862, produced the Chicago and Alton Railroad. The C&M had chartered the Alton and St. Louis Railroad to extend the line to East Street. Louis opened in 1864, giving it a line from Chicago to East Street. Louis. In 1925, Chicago and Alton carried 2,143 million revenue ton-miles of freight and 202 million revenue passenger miles on 1,056 miles of road and 1,863 miles of track. Same numbers for 1944 were 2,596, 483, 959 and 1717. Railroad family tree. Kansas City Line, Springfield, Kansas City and Godfrey Roadhouse. Gateway Western Railway 1997. Present Gateway Western is a Kansas City Southern Railway subsidiary. 1990 to 1997, Gateway Western was an affiliate of the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe Railway. Chicago, Missouri and Western Railway 1987 to 1989. Chicago Street. Louis Line, Union Pacific Railroad 1996. Present Chicago Street. Louis Line, SPCSL Corporation 1989 to 1996, a subsidiary of Southern Pacific Transportation Company. Chicago, Missouri and Western Railway 1987 to 1989. Early years of Alton. Chicago, Missouri and Western Railway 1987 to 1989. Illinois Central Gulf Railroad 1972 to 1987. Gulf, Mobile and Ohio Railroad 1947 to 1972. Alton Railroad 1931 to 1947, subsidiary of Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. Chicago and Alton Railroad 1906-1931 took over line from Peoria. Springfield, Chicago and Alton Railway 1900 to 1906, controlled by Up and Rock, later NKP P. Chicago and Alton Railroad 1861 to 1900, Kansas City, St. Louis and Chicago Railroad 1878 to 1950, leased by Alton, Mexico, Kansas City, Louisiana and Missouri River Railroad 1870 to 1950, leased by Alton, Louisiana, Springfield, Missouri, Joliet and Chicago Railroad 1864 to 1950, leased by Alton, Joliet, Chicago, St. Louis, Alton and Chicago Railroad c. 1857 to 1861, Alton, Joliet, Alton and Sangamon Railroad 1847 c. 1857, Springfield, Alton. Passenger service notables. The first sleeping car designed by George Pullman was built in the C&A's Bloomington shops and introduced on September 1, 1859 on the Chicago-St. Louis route. Sleeping cars were operated over most routes between Chicago, Peoria, Bloomington, St. Louis and Kansas City. In principal, train consists. Successor Gulf, Mobile and AMP, Ohio operated Chicago St. Louis sleeping car service until December 31, 1969, the last railroad to do so between the two cities. The first dining car, the Delmonico, named for the famous New York restaurant, was built by Pullman in the Aurora, Illinois shops of the Chicago, Burlington and AMP, Quincy. The car first appeared in regular service over the C&A's Chicago St. Louis Main Line. Two other Pullman diners built at the same time, the Tremont and the Southern, were leased, providing dining car service on all three principal C&A Chicago St. Louis trains. Dining cars were a part of Chicago St. Louis train consists until May 1, 1971, with the takeover of passenger service by Amtrak. Notable passenger trains: the Alton Limited, Abraham Lincoln, and Rutledge, the Hummer, the Midnight Special. Stations in Chicago. First entry of C&A, the passenger trains from Joliet into Chicago, was over the Chicago and AMP, Rock Island to the railroad's depot. Briefly, passenger trains were moved over to the Illinois Central Depot. On December 28, 1863, the leased J&AMP-C in Pittsburgh, Fort Wayne and Chicago Railway came to an agreement where the J&AMP-C would use the PFW and AMP-C's terminal at Madison Street, later becoming a tenant of Union Station, which opened in 1881. In 1924, with the completion of a new Union Station between Adams and Jackson Streets, C&A became a tenant and its successors used Union Station until the takeover by Amtrak. Company offices. Presidents of the Alton Railroad have included Timothy Blackstone (1864–1899), Samuel Morse Felton, Jr. (1899–1908),